What's happening, people? We're back for the final day of Classical Days. I wanted to give a big thank you to all those who've been following along, to Michaela, who's been commenting on all the videos, and to a friend of the channel who has requested I do a reaction to Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky's first piano concerto in B-flat minor, which is one of the most famous concerti, certainly among piano concerti, in the world. And in fact, there's a significance here that I wasn't fully aware of. Now, this is a piano concerto I do know, but I don't know it as well, or I haven't heard it as many times, rather, as some other concerti in my collection. And that's because this isn't actually in my collection. When I was first asked a couple months ago, I started searching through my collection, and I realized I don't have a copy of this. Now, I have heard it, and you might not be surprised to find this is yet another piece heard over the course of the series Notame Cantabile. Once again, if you haven't seen the series, I highly recommend it, and I will put a link to my full watch-along over on Patreon here in the video description. But yes, this is a world-famous concerto, and the personal connection, as it turns out, is that my dad, who is the instigator of my own love of classical music when I was a single-digit kid and I was growing up in my household or my family's household, I was always hearing classical music and became a big fan of some different composers and just classical music more generally. And recently, when I went to my parents' house and I said, hey, I'm looking to do a reaction series to Tchaikovsky's first piano concerto, I've discovered that I don't actually have a copy of it among my many CDs. Do you have a copy or a recording? My dad said, of course I have a recording. I have a couple different recordings. I think he said a few different recordings. And, did you know? And he proceeded to tell me an anecdote, which I don't recall him ever telling me before, so it was quite a revelation. And that is, he said this concerto is where his love of classical music came from, and it's what made him into the huge classical music fan he was by the time I was born and was growing up. So, to give you the cliff notes, because this first movement that we're going to listen to is quite long, the short version is my dad, when he was in his teens, he was born in the mid-40s, he learned about a piano competition specifically for Tchaikovsky, and specifically with this piano concerto as the piece that was used in the competition, took place in the Soviet Union, I think in Moscow. An American pianist, Van Cliburn, performed it so well that the Russian judges were at first a little can we really give him this award? Obviously that relates to the Cold War and the way that not just politically but culturally, socially, the US and the Soviet Union were always trying to get the better of each other and prove that they were the better system. The judges were really impressed by Van Cliburn's performance, but because it's a Russian composer, the competition was in Russia, some of the other contestants were Russian, I guess, or so the story goes, they were hesitant to give him the award, so they consulted a political authority, and this person said, well, look, did this American play it impressively, or the best among the contestants? And they said, yes, in our estimation he did, and my understanding is that this political authority said, all right, well then give him the award. So Van Cliburn won this award for a Tchaikovsky piano concerto in Moscow, and he became sort of a celebrity here. And it was in the wake of that my dad learned about it and wanted to seek out the concerto. And he eventually heard it and was so blown away by it that he then dove headfirst into piano music and classical music and became the aficionado of classical music that he was by the time I was born and growing up. So I ended up hearing a lot of classical music as a kid, in part because years earlier he had been drawn to the genre because of this piano concerto. So in a very realistic way, I'm sitting here doing Classical Days and have been sharing my love of classical music with you because of my dad's hearing this concerto and falling in love with it decades earlier. So yes, that's the personal anecdote. This is once again a piece used in Notame, so it also fits into what I've been doing these last 5 to 6 days, which is not only sharing my love of classical music, but indicating just how many incredible works form the substance of that show, which of course has great comedy and human drama as well. So Bottom line, this is an incredible concerto that, again, I don't know as well as some other pieces, but I've certainly heard over the years, and not just in Notame. And this first movement in particular, which is quite long, is stunning. Just the way it starts, the first 30 seconds, you're just drawn in instantly by both the piano and the orchestra. So as I said, my dad has some different recordings of this. I ripped 2 of them from his collection. We're going to listen to one that's a bit shorter, even though, again, the first movement in this recording is like 20 minutes long. The other recording I ripped, which is performed by a pianist named, I think it's like Ivo Pogorelic, that one, the first movement's like 23 minutes. So my expectation is that this might be a bit tidier, a bit brisker, a bit quicker. Nevertheless, at some point in the future, I would be willing to go through another recording of this. Obviously, we'll do some things in classical reactions between now and then, but yes, at some point down the line, we can listen to the other recording that I have now. In any case, the pianist for this recording is André Watts, another American pianist, and the conductor, make sure I have this right, it's like Yoel Levi, I think. Make sure that's correct. Yes, Yoel Levi, and we're going to hear the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra under his conduction. So this first movement is an Allegro non troppo e molto maestoso, and that means fast but not too much, and very majestically, very stately. So that's the musical direction. Let's start it off. This is Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky's first piano concerto in B-flat minor, and it's Opus 23, and the first movement is Allegro non troppo e molto maestoso. I mean, what do you even say? It is so monumental. It very much comes across as stately, majestic, big and grand, dramatic. And of course, the playing is both forte, a lot of it is forte, big chords, struck with great passion and power, but there are some more lyrical and, let's say, sonorous or melodic passages, but a lot of fast playing, and of course, when in good time I listened to the Ivo Pogorelic recording, which, as I said, I think each of the movements is a little bit longer. Like this, I think, was almost 20 minutes. The first movement in the Pogorelic recording is like 23 minutes, so presumably some of the passages are played a little bit, maybe not slower, but less briskly, but the rising and falling melodic lines of the piano, the intensity, the dynamic nature of the playing really does stand out. Now, fair to say, it's not just a sonata, it's a concerto, and the orchestra is doing a lot of big dramatic things as well. The strings with those sharp stings, maybe, like it really has this like intense injection of drama in conjunction with the piano, and I enjoy, as I said, that big stately opening with the very sonorous sweeping orchestra and strings in particular providing the accompaniment. So there's so much going on here. There was a middle passage which I wasn't recalling going into this, where again the piano got a little bit more melodic and lyrical that I particularly enjoyed, maybe in part because I wasn't thinking of it. I was mainly thinking of that opening in some of the bigger sections. But yes, it's just a monumental opening movement and a stunning bit of composition from Tchaikovsky. Now, my understanding about that is that this piece went through 3 different versions. It was originally composed in, I think, 1874 to 1875. I think it debuted either that year or the year after. And then he revised it a bit in 1878, and I think partly in response to his pianist friend whose surname is like Rubinstein. And I think Rubinstein at first was a bit critical of the concerto, but then became a big champion of it and, sort of popularized it. But then in 1888, like over a decade later, I think Tchaikovsky revised it again. And I think that third and final revision is the version that has become the standard that is now played in orchestras and among pianists around the world. So yes, if I'm wrong about that, do let me know, but that's my understanding. So yes, I mean, how do you even follow up an opening movement like that? Well, we're about to find out with movements 2 and 3, but I feel it's fair to regard this opening movement as one of the more bold, dramatic, and astounding or majestic statements in piano composition, certainly, but classical music composition more broadly even. So, once again, a big piece in musical history, a big piece in my dad's love of classical music, and a big piece, thus by extension, in why I became a classical music fan, and a big piece in Nota Me Cantabile. I will keep pushing that show. So yeah, I'll be back in a moment for the second movement, but take a bow, André Watts, take a bow, Ivo is the pianist, what is it again? Yoel Levi, I believe. Yes, Yoel Levi and the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra. So, yes, let me know what you think, and I'll see you for the next movement in a moment. Peace.